My name is Todd. I manage Phoenix Books here in Burlington, and we're so happy to work with everybody here tonight and celebrate the release of Chris Bohjalian's 25th book, Jackal's Mistress. And before I talk a little bit more about Chris, I wanted to thank Garrett Graff for being here as well. Garrett. You've probably seen Garrett on the news or seen him on social media. He is one of the top political commentators in our country. He's got a couple books coming out. Just want to mention real quick. He's the editor of a book by the Vermont Historical Society about an oral history of the pandemic in Vermont. That comes out in a couple weeks, which is really cool. And then he's got a book, which is the oral history of the Manhattan Project. What's the title?
The Devil Reached Toward the Sky.
The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, and that's coming out later this year. And so we'll look forward to all of those. And I thank Garrett very much for being here in conversation tonight. So, but we're here to celebrate Chris and Chris Bohjalian and his book tonight. This is a historical fiction with a Vermont character. And thank you so much for getting a copy of that book with your ticket tonight. And Chris is a great fan of Phoenix, a great supporter of Phoenix, and we hope that we return that to him. If you don't know Chris, please stay and get your book signed and personalized after the event, and I'm sure he'll be able to charm you as he charms everybody out in the world, which is really great. So what's going to happen tonight is Chris and Garrett are going to come up and be in conversation, and we'll have time for your questions. And then we'll have Chris downstairs at a signing table, and he'll be able to autograph and personalize all your books. And we're not actually supposed to sell this book until Tuesday. That's the release date. But you all are getting your books early, and if you wanted more copies of The Jackal's Mistress, we can sell them to you tonight. So there are copies of that downstairs as well. So come on in. No, it's all right. Come on in now, and then we can because otherwise then we'll be we'll applaud for you instead of these guys. So without any further ado, I want to thank you all again very much for coming. I'm going to have Chris and Gary come right up to the front.
Thank you.
My thanks to Phoenix Books, to all of the booksellers here, and to all of you who are joining us tonight on a Saturday night. Now, before Garrett and I begin, this is my 25th book, but it is my 35th book tour, which is far more of an accomplishment. And as some of you know, there is always swag. Tonight, the swag has gone green and environmental, rock and roll, canvas, tote bags, with the names of all of the venues on them. We will be giving those away during the question and answer. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to be in conversation with Garrett is because he is freaking brilliant, a fantastic historian, a fantastic journalist, and here is one moment you can't make up. Last year, my lovely bride, Victoria, and I are reading together in bed, and I look over and realize that she is reading Garrett's book, UFO, and I am reading Garrett's book, When the Sea Came Alive, about D-Day. And I realized, oh my gosh, we are both reading books by Garrett Graff. We've got to do a gig together someday. So Garrett, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Chris. I'm enormously excited to do this in part because while I mostly write as a 20th and 21st century historian, my childhood obsession is the Civil War and Vermont in the Civil War. And so a book about a Vermonter in the Shenandoah Valley in the Civil War was as close to sort of reader catnip as I could get.
Writing it was catnip for me too.
So I'm going to actually just start off tonight and ask you a little bit about this book, and then step back and ask you a little bit more broadly about your writing and your work. You have said in the past that the books that you write fastest are the ones that sort of gestate longest. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the origin of where this idea came from and how this book gestated from idea to an actual novel.
Yeah, this book has had an elephant's gestation period. Back in 2003, before some people in this room might have been born, an editor at Reader's Digest told me a story about a guy in the Vermont Brigade who was gravely wounded in the Shenandoah Valley, and the rebel woman who risked everything to keep him alive. And did I want to write about this? And I said, of course, it sounds really interesting. And I lived in Lincoln, Vermont at the time, and most of the papers about this footnote to Civil War history were at Middlebury College. So I had a great time researching, and I wrote this story. Cut to 2022. I have thought periodically about this dying Vermonter and this Virginian who tried to save his life. And now I'm in Richmond on a book tour. And when you are in Richmond, Virginia, you really feel the weight of the Civil War. You really feel it in ways that you don't here in Vermont, where the closest thing we had to a battle was a bank robbery that failed in St. Albans. And I thought about that story I had written 19 years earlier and realized that in it was a story that I needed to write now, given how divided our country was. And it seemed to me, and I thought back to this conversation I'd heard years ago between David McCullough and Terry Gross, and Terry Gross said to David McCullough in 2016 or 17, David, as an historian, have you ever seen the country as divided as we are now? And David had this great laugh. Oh, Terry, there was that dust up in 1861, and 1968 wasn't pretty. And I thought, okay, in that story that you wrote for Reader's Digest 19 years ago is your next book. It is going to be a Civil War Romeo and Juliet, a novel about the North and the South, written on the assumption that if an abolitionist from Vermont and a rebel woman in Virginia can figure it out, that there just might be hope for America, and I was off and running.
So, and as you're starting, Chris and I actually, we have been Instagram friends for many years, but we actually met for the first time together at the Mississippi Book Festival last summer.
Speaking of lost cause.
Yes. And I asked you a question then that I will ask you here on stage for the record, which is how much of a story do you feel like you need to know before you start writing it?
I need to know a premise, a really vague premise. Midwife on trial for manslaughter after a home birth goes really bad. Or flight attendant wakes up far from home next to a dead body and she's a blackout drunk and has no idea what happened. That's really all I need. Then I need to know, is it first person, third person, and I'm off. So for this book, I knew the two fundamental basics. Gravely wounded Vermonter, lonely woman in Virginia trying desperately to keep it together, pining for her rebel husband who's in a Union POW camp, and I was off and running.
And for one of the things that I think is so interesting about your writing is so many novelists stick to one era or sort of one type of story. And almost every single one of your books, leaps around generation to generation, country to country, conflict to conflict. And as someone who sort of studies history for a living, I know how much research goes into having to understand an era and a moment. Talk a little bit about the research that you did for this book and how you go about tackling a new era when you're setting foot into it.
Yeah. I really do my homework, as do you. One of the things that John Gardner, great teacher of writing, who used to teach at Breadloaf, wrote in The Art of Fiction. There are two ways to wake a reader from the fictional dream: bad writing and bad research. So you have to do your homework. So for this book, there were really three kinds of research that I did. The primary research, the memoirs, the letters, the secondary research, the histories, and then the third kind of research, interviewing experts, one of whom is in the audience, and I've got to give a shout out to in just a moment, and traveling from the Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, through Harper's Ferry, Third Battle of Winchester, through the Shenandoah, and into Richmond. My lovely bride, Victoria Bluer, and I made that particular research trip, and it was wonderful. I've got to give a shout out, though, to Dr. Ken Borey. Ken, are you in the house tonight? Okay, there's one of the great family medicine doctors in Vermont in the house. He's from Randolph. But Ken Borey is also a descendant of one of the Union heroes of Chancellorsville and an expert, or really knowledgeable, about Civil War medicine. Ken not only said three things to me that were really important, aside from all the minutiae he taught me. Number one, we talked at length about the psychological trauma of being a soldier who suddenly had a leg and most of a hand blown off and is left to die, what Drew Gilpin Faust would have called the good death in her book, The Republic of Suffering. He said you need to begin your research at the Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, and what the doctor says I do, so we did. And for an unbelievably kind, decent, intellectual painter, physician, he owns bone saws from the 19th century. He owns his ancestors, who's a hero of Chancellorsville in the Union Army's saber. So hanging out with Ken was way too much fun for the little boy in me. Thank you, Ken. Also, I hadn't met Ken until I started researching this book. But in terms of what a great small world Vermont is, Ken's wife, Mary, works in labor and delivery at the hospital in Randolph. So, in theory, our paths could have crossed when I was researching midwives back in the day.
And as you got into this, talk a little bit about how did you use the foundation of the real story? What parts of it did you want to adopt and carry through and hold true? And then where did you feel like you could depart? And how did the characters along the way sort of surprise you as you were writing it?
Okay, here's why my life is so much better than yours. I could depart wherever I wanted. I'm making stuff up. You can't do that. I mean, when you're writing, whether you're writing about 9/11 or you're writing about D-Day, you can't make stuff up. I can make up whatever I want. So long as it is grounded in the research. That's the important caveat. Because you can only make the world believable in the context of the history. So, we know very, very little about Vermonter Henry Bedell, Vermont Brigade, and Betty Van Meter. We know that Betty Van Meter is married to Peter. She has two formerly enslaved people helping her to run her husband's gristmill, and we know she's a 10-year-old niece. We know from a letter she wrote to the governor of Vermont in 1914 that she tried to save Bedell's life because she thought, and she didn't use the word karma, but that's what she's thinking, if my husband were dying in Maryland or Pennsylvania, I would want a Yankee woman to try and save him. So that's literally all we know. We know that she went to Harper's Ferry to try and get him whiskey and medicine because whiskey was sort of the children's aspirin of 1864. It was what you took for everything. And we know that she had to keep him hidden from John Mosby's Confederate Rangers, who pretty soon would be hanging Custer's cavalrymen in this part of the Shenandoah Valley. And so Custer would be hanging Mosby's Rangers. We know that she needs to keep him hidden from Jubal Early's Confederate Army. And we know that after 2 months, she made an attempt to bring him back across the Confederate lines to Union headquarters at Harper's Ferry. But other than that, I could basically do whatever I wanted, and I loved the idea of this being a love story. We have no idea if Henry Bedell and Betty Van Meter ever had anything other than a deep platonic friendship. In my novel, they can be passionately in love with each other and never consummate it, or they can be passionately in love with each other and having, 2 extramarital affairs. It's up to me.
And talk to me, though, about that writing process as you sort of sit down and think about sort of from that idea, from in this case, the true story. How does that unfold for you? How do you think about it? My mother is a writer as well.
And a really good writer. I mean, I've read your mom's books.
Well, thank you. I will tell her that.
She knows, actually.
Yeah. And one of the things that she said to me when I was growing up that I will always remember about writing is she's like, writing is one of the only jobs where you can be lying on the couch with your eyes closed and be working as hard as you need to be. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that process and how these characters come alive for you.
She's right. She's absolutely right. I don't spend a lot of time on the couch in the afternoon. I should, especially if it's a therapist's couch. But I do spend most of my afternoons in the summer, in the spring and the fall, on my bike. And it's on my bike that I solve so many problems that I'm going to fix the next day when I'm writing. So a typical day for me is I'm woken up by my incredible, sidekick, Jessie, my dog, and my lovely bride, Victoria, and I are sort of pulled out of bed by the dog and the cats, and I walk the dog, and then I get to my desk by 8 in the morning. Prior to the pandemic and getting a dog, I would have been at my desk at 6 in the morning. Now it's 8, and that's fine. And I write for 4 or 5 hours, have lunch with my lovely bride, Victoria, and then I go for a bike ride. And I will write whole scenes at a gazebo in New Haven or the bridge across Lake Champlain dictating into my cell phone. They're not good scenes, but they are the basics that I need for the next morning to write a better scene. I think Jodi Picoult once said, it's a whole lot easier to edit garbage than a blank page. And that is my mantra every day.
And so as you got into this book, what about the characters surprised you?
Okay, another great Civil War historian in Vermont is Howard Coffin. And when I told Howard Coffin I was writing this book, and like Ken Borey, Howard read a rough draft of it. Howard said to me, you make a mistake with the Civil War, and people will tell you. And then he said with this twinkle in his eye, what do you think about those two? Do you think they were lovers? And I love that because that was the fundamental question that we will never know the answer to, ever. But that was what kept me writing this book and getting me excited to be at my desk in the morning because it's a love story. And whether it's consummated or not, it's about 2 human beings who are really trying to do their best in circumstances that are cataclysmic.
And that's true for a lot of your books, is you set them against a larger cataclysm or characters who are sort of on the margins of society. In the midst of a conflict, in the midst of some upheaval. What about those moments interests you as a writer?
Education. Literally, education. And that's the difference between what you do and what I do. You really educate people to the issues, to what's going on, to the history, capital H. The difference between what you do and historical fiction, what I do is this. I can take moments in time that people otherwise would have known nothing about and not cared about and will be interested. And I do that by focusing on ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. For example, and I really learned this in 2012, with my novel, The Sandcastle Girls. It's a love story set in the midst of the Armenian genocide. If I set out to write a memoir about my grandparents in the Armenian genocide, literally no one would have read it because no one had heard of the Armenian genocide. But because it's a love story and because I called it The Sandcastle Girls, not 1.5 million dead in the desert, people read it. And it educated millions of people around the world to the Armenian genocide. And so a book like The Jackal's Mistress is a love story. But other than Eric Larson's book about Sumter, not a lot of books have sold well about the Civil War in the last 10 years. And my sense is that the way in is through fiction.
One of the things that also sort of I'm always fascinated by as a nonfiction writer in thinking about how fiction gets plotted and as you pull them together are these sort of the Chekhov gun moments, you know, the things that you sort of set up early in the book for the payoff later. There's one character in this book, and I unlike my writing where most people know the ending of the books that I write, I will not give away the significance.
A lot of surprises in UFO, Garrett.
There's one character, I think it's Henry Morgan, who's a Confederate lieutenant who's from Jubal Early's army, who sort of appears early in the book and then appears in a very significant way later in the book. Talk to me a little bit about how you place those characters as you're writing early in the book. Like, how much do you know about what role he'll play later in the book when you introduce him, and how do those sort of little twists and tales of the book threads come together later?
Unlike an historian, a novelist is usually either a outliner or a pantser. A pantser is someone who writes by the seat of his or their pants. They literally have no idea what's coming next. I am a pantser. So, you mentioned Henry Morgan. When I introduced Lieutenant Henry Morgan early into the book, I thought he might be a chivalrous Confederate officer. As I got into the book, as I learned more about Mosby's Rangers, as I learned more about the spectacular acts of cruelty, he morphed. And by the third or fourth draft of the book, he was a very different character. You can see that also in the 12-year-old niece. One of the things I hate in a novel is when the children are furniture. And that's all they are, is furniture. And I wanted to make sure that Jubilee, the 12-year-old niece, inspired by a 10-year-old niece whose name we do not even know, I wanted her to be either a rabid Confederate or a very, very, by the standards of 1864, questioning tween. And as she grew more and more into a character like Connie Danforth in Midwives, or Marissa Dowling in The Princess of Las Vegas, the ultimate badass tween.
And she is the one, and this is not giving away a significant point, who comes up with the moniker Jackal that becomes the name that the family calls the wounded soldier. Talk to me about that decision. I thought that was such an interesting decision, and then the way that Jackal obviously then becomes the title. Like, how much of that do you know coming in? And talk to us a little bit about the naming of the Jackal.
Isn't Jackal a great word?
It is.
I mean, and obviously there are plenty of books with Jackal in the title. Originally, Jackal was not in the title. Originally, the title was going to be simply something along the lines of Shenandoah, or another title I was toying with was simply Libby Stedman, which is the name of my rebel heroine. But then it morphed when Jubilee christens this Yankee abolitionist the Jackal, and she calls him that because in the early parts of his recovery, he's just lying in bed. Everyone is bringing him food, the little food they have. Everyone else is cleaning his slop jar. Everyone else is spoon feeding him. And she is working like crazy because she is the only human being who isn't big enough to work in the grist mill itself. So she takes to calling him the Jackal because he is seeming to be slothful and taking advantage of everyone around him and lying in bed. But then she begins to discover a certain affinity for him, just as he begins to discover, because he's a Middlebury College professor, an interest in her intellectual growth, especially her relationship to the formerly enslaved people who are at the grist mill. And this becomes sort of an important messaging part in the book. You know, you can in a novel hit people over the head with morals. You can, but it's not a good novel. But she's instrumental to that messaging. And one of the other things I think is really interesting for writing this book is this. Jonathan Weybridge, my Yankee abolitionist, who loses a leg and much of a hand, is physically reminiscent of the actual Yankee in real life, Henry Bedell. But his voice comes from Aldous Walker. Aldous Walker was the Middlebury College valedictorian, class of 1862. By 1864, he was a major in the Vermont Brigade because officer attrition was really high, given the tactics of the time. By 1865, he would be a lieutenant colonel. And in 1869, he wrote a book, The Vermont Brigade in the Shenandoah Valley. And 6 pages of it are what he calls in chapter 8 an episode. And the episode is all we know about the death and resurrection of Henry Bedell Jr. And Aldous Walker was such a remarkable human being that not only would he be publishing this book at the age of 29, he would pass the bar in 2 states, and in his 6-page episode, he leaves out one detail. He was the one who saved Henry Bedell's life. He was the one who took Bedell's canteen, took the cord from it, tied it around his thigh to staunch the bleeding so that he could at least be evacuated to a field hospital.
I was really struck. The author's note at the end tells a lot of this story, and it's remarkable reading the book and then reading that note and sort of realizing the research that went into this and sort of the. I think it really changes the way that you reflect upon the book, realizing sort of how much of this might have actually happened. Yeah. So to me, one of the great challenges of being a writer is the way that it manages to ruin the things that you're supposed to do for fun and relaxation by turning almost all reading into work. And I wonder if you could tell us sort of how do you read fiction? How do you do this thing that the rest of us get to do for relaxation and fun and as the mental escape and break in our day, that you pick apart every other fiction book that you read? How much do you feel that you need to sort of keep up with, this trend or that trend or this author and that author? Sort of tell us, how do you read fiction?
I love fiction. I love books. I love your books. And I love books that give me an inferiority complex. I really don't mind reading a novel, and I think to myself, I will never write a book that good. I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that. And the other thing that's really interesting about fiction for me now. So February 2020, my lovely bride and I get a dog. March of 2020, I'm really worried that this dog, this rescue dog, is never going to bond with me. I'm going to be another deserting human because I'm about to go on a 3-week book tour. Obviously, the world intervenes. No book tour because it is March of 2020. Then I lose my voice to COVID. What you are hearing, obviously, some of you are thinking, oh my gosh, he has laryngitis. I don't. This is my new voice. Thank you, COVID. But do not fret for me. I'm fine. More on that in a moment. So it's now 2020, and I'm reading a lot because I'm not going anywhere. I'm in the woods a lot with my dog, and I'm listening to a lot of audiobooks. And something began to happen to how I read fiction. All of the sudden, and this is really true by the end of 2020, because now it's been like 9 months when I've been practically mute. And I'm pretty sure that I'm never going to be able to speak again. And so much what I do is being charming. And being charming is being able to speak. I mean, I'm not handsome, so I have to be able to speak. And it's gone. So all of a sudden, I'm in the woods with my beloved dog, who really is my sidekick. We are so joined at the hip. And I'm listening to audiobooks, and I'm weeping. And I never used to cry, ever. I mean, I eulogized both of my parents, and I was a friggin' Netflix comedy special. I killed it. I owned those rooms. And now, all of a sudden, I'm running in the woods or walking in the woods with my dog, and I'm coming to the end of a book, and Only Plane in the Sky was just gutting. I'm sorry, but one, it's a fantastic book. Anyway, but I could be reading a thriller by my friend Harlan Coben or Karen Slaughter, and I'm coming, but is that the best name for a thriller writer ever, Karen Slaughter? I would kill for that name. Anyway, so I'm in the woods, and now it happens all the time with books. I am weeping whenever I finish any novel, and not because it's beautiful or terrible, but just because it's a novel. And I'm coming to the end of it, and maybe it's some metaphor for the intransigence of how transient life is, how everything comes to an end. Who knows? But that's one of the ways my reading of fiction has changed. Here's another reason, another way it's changed, and this affects all of us in this room. I used to be able to take a hardcover book and read for hours. No more. My attention span has completely gone to hell because of great TV and my phone. The only way I can read a book with, for literally 2 hours at a time now is by leaving my phone in my library, going to the other side of the house and taking the book with me into the bath. Usually when I'm reading in bed beside Victoria, I'll read 10 pages and then check the score of the Mets game. Read 10 more pages and then play some words with friends. Read 10 more pages and get an endorphin hit from Instagram. So that's changed. But I'm off the clock when I'm reading someone else's novel. I'm really, I fell in love, for example, last fall with Sally Rooney's Intermezzo and realized I will never write a book about siblings that smart. And that's fine.
I think it is such a fantastic moment to find those books as a writer that are so much better than anything that you could ever write. We were talking at dinner beforehand about Adam Higginbotham's book on Challenger, which to me is just one of those, like, Adam, I will never write anything as good as the basic page that Adam Higginbotham writes. I think we should open it up to questions.
Yes, we should, if you'd like. And the first question is the hardest for you and for me. So whoever is willing to ask the first question gets the first Jackal's Mistress. Oh, that hand went up fast. Cameron, what's your name?
Gretchen.
Hi, Gretchen.
Hi.
Thanks, Todd.
Picking up on what you were talking about with the attention span, because I think we all are in that sort of miserable space now where we realize that our attention spans are never coming back. Do you see it having an impact on the way that people write? Like, do you see some of your favorite writers that you followed throughout their career? Is it impacting the way you write? Or the way
Gretchen it's a great question. Gretchen wants to know if the fact we read differently affects how we write. It does. To wit, I don't know, 12 years ago, I fell in love with shows like The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Succession, The Americans. It's a long list. And I really began to lean into dread. So in books like The Light and the Ruins, which is about one Italian family's collaboration with the fascists in Tuscany in World War II, it morphed into a book about a serial killer who cuts out the hearts of victims in Florence. Just one example. Yes. How are you?
I'm good, how are you?
How's Connor?
Connor's great, and he has not stopped talking about you. He said, he went home and told his father, he goes, I met a real-life author, and he knows my favorite author, and I'm going to go to Massachusetts, and I'm going to meet him.
I do know Jeff Kinney, so yeah.
I know. So, thank you for that. But I have to disagree, and I think that you are very educational on every single one of your books, because you do educate, even though you are fiction. Every single one of your books do have some element of education. Midwives, homeless people, sexual assault, mental illness. Every book you have written has some element of
Thank you.
of education entwined in every book you've ever written.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I'm just curious.
And what's your name?
My name is Susan.
Hi, Susan.
How do you decide the book is done?
How do you decide the book is done? When I hit 100,000 words? No, it's not that simple. No. A book is basically a roller coaster. A novel is a roller coaster. And you've got all of the elements of a roller coaster. You've got the warm-up, you go up the hill, you've got the climax, and then you've got the denouement. And you feel it in your muscle memory. You know when the story is done. And it's not because I'm bored, though I might be. Though if I'm bored, that's a bad sign. But because the character's heroic journey is complete. He or she or they have accomplished or failed to accomplish what they set out to do. And I don't mind books that break my heart. I love it when a book breaks my heart. And I write books that I know break some people's hearts. And that's fine. Not every hero's journey ends happily. And one of the things that Jonathan Weybridge thinks about in The Jackal's Mistress is that great, and forgive me, I'm not remembering which particular part of Greek mythology it's from, but I believe it's from the Odyssey. Either with his sword or on his sword. Either on his sword or on his shield. And the whole idea, Jonathan Weybridge thinks, of a mother's son coming home on his shield is devastating, and he knows at this point in the book it's a very real possibility. So it's a possibility for the reader. Yes, and what's your name?
Have any of your other novels been optioned for movies or series that we can expect?
Yes, I've had 3 books become movies, 1 a TV series. I have 2 more in development, and I would love to tell you all about them, but I can't. Sorry.
At least we know we can look forward to it.
Well, don't get your hopes up. God knows I don't. This is Hollywood. Hollywood designed to break your heart. Yes. Hi, and what's your name?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
I would like to know what your favorite character is that you've written and what your favorite book is that you've written and if they match.
What is my favorite character? What is my favorite book? And do they match? They don't. I don't have a favorite book, but I have books that matter to me. The Sandcastle Girls, because my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide, and that book educated so many millions to the Armenian genocide. Midwives, because twice it became a bestseller. The second time, a really big bestseller, thank you, Oprah Winfrey, which in a monumental way changed my life. And I'm going to say The Flight Attendant because even though most of it was filmed during the pandemic, it was really a fun process.
What about the character, though?
Oh, you know, my favorite character is from a book that very few people outside of this room has read. You know that expression, it sold like hotcakes. This is a book that sold like whatever's the opposite of hotcakes. It came out in 2014. How many of you have read Close Your Eyes, Hold Hands? See, it's in Burlington, so a lot of hands go up. If I ask that question a week from tonight in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, there will be one hand. It'll go up like this. Emily Shepard, homeless teen, living on the Burlington waterfront, trying to keep it together after a meltdown at Vermont's lone nuclear plant. Emily Shepard, I loved Emily as a dad, and it always makes me sad that no one found her. Thank you. Yeah. Burlington did. Well, no, it's still out there. Re-release it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I will try. Yes.
My name's Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
And I've seen you speak many times, and I've always wanted to ask you about Transistor.
Do it.
So, I have many questions. It was early 2000s, if I remember correctly. When
It was the year 2000, yes.
2000.
Anyone who asks about Transistor Radio gets a tote bag.
These are the best books.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I feel like that would be a good one to re-release right now.
Transistor Radio, for those of you who've not read it, is a transgender love story. It is set in Vermont, and it is called Transistor Radio because one of the main characters is the general manager of Vermont Public, or what was then Vermont Public Radio, and his daughter does an all things considered story about her mother and her mother's lover who is transgender. I'm really proud of that book, and it was ahead of its time. I had a bookseller in San Francisco, a bastion of forward thinking, say to me when I am on tour, people pick up your book, Transistor Radio, and they say, oh my gosh, he wrote Midwives. I loved Midwives. Then they read what it's about, and they put it down like it has the Ebola virus. I think right now, I would much prefer that trans stories were told by trans voices. There are so many brilliant trans writers out there, and there's some things I'm perfectly willing to write about as an over-the-hill cis male. But that's a story that I will defer to the trans community.
Well, I understand that as a cis woman who read it in my early 30s, it educated me in a way that shaped who I am today with my friends today.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for that. And also curious, did you have pushback when you, at the time?
Yeah, first of all, it was such a different era that I wrote that book, and I was on the cover of Transgender Tapestry because they were, the community was so excited. #1 best-selling author has written a trans love story. And I did get pushback. You can look at the sales figures to see the pushback. But I'm glad I wrote it. At the time, I'm really, really proud of it.
Thank you.
I lived on North Winooski Avenue, and the there was a trans support group that was meeting right, and me and my children used to walk right by at the same time that your book came out. And we would walk by, and my big Connor's father, we would walk by and he would make a comment because we could see them in the window. And we would talk, and I.
For Connor.
And I would mention, and my son would say, why are they dressed like girls? And I'd say, and I would explain to them. And so my son is now, knew the difference and was very accepting of all kinds of people. So because of your book and your question. So I think it's, even though you were a cis male, I think it's very appropriate that you educated
Thank you.
lots of people, because I wouldn't have known.
Here is one of the weird footnotes to that book that I love. For 4 years, that book was in development for a movie with Wes Craven.
Wow.
Who's next? Yes.
Hi, I'm Glenn.
Hey, Glenn.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit more about your kind of planning and thinking process that went into the travel kind of research part for this book, and how it might be similar or different from what you've done for other books, which are place-based? It's
Yes.
really rich in terms of that's as much a character in the Shenandoah Valley in the book as the characters, the people characters.
Place is a character in all my books, certainly my Vermont books. But you have to go to the place to write about it. So when I write about Italy, I go to Italy. When I write about the Serengeti, I go to the Serengeti. When I write about the Shenandoah Valley, I go to the Shenandoah Valley. And I've been so fortunate. Victoria has been with me on most of these trips. Victoria is a treasure for 2 reasons as a novelist. One, she's read every one of my 3.6 million words before they were published. And as she once said to me, when apparently I was pushing back on a suggestion, wouldn't you rather hear it from me than the New York Times? And it is great to have a world-class photographer with you when you want to see the Winchester, the Third Battle of Winchester. Vietnam, or the Serengeti, because Victoria has been with me on all of those journeys. So thank you. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Chris.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. A comment, actually, because you said that we will never know if they have consummated their affair goes any farther. I've not read the book, so I'm just kind of supposing. And you also say that when a book is finished, it's finished. But that's for you. See, for me, as a reader, that could be different.
Yeah.
I think Scarlett and Wreck got together again. I can continue to imagine. And that's the gift that you give us.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And I want to clarify one thing. I said in real life, we do not know if Betty Van Meter and Henry Bedell ever consummated their relationship. You will learn whether the Jackal and the Mistress do.
Good, thank you.
No, thank you. Okay, we can do, who came really far to be here?
Me?
Okay. Did anyone come further than Stowe?
Oh, you got it.
Where are you from?
Walpole, New Hampshire.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes, what's your name?
Jenny,
Hi, Jenny.
I'm very interested in, with your storytelling, how do you decide on the point of view that you're going to tell the story from?
How do you decide on the point of view? It's the only thing you need to know in addition to the premise. And here, from my perspective, is how I decide, first or third person. And I have done some second person, but it's usually first or third. Do I have a voice? First person, idiosyncratic, so interesting that I can revolve a book around it. For example, midwives. I used the word vulva as a child, the way some kids said butt or penis or puke. It wasn't a swear exactly, but I knew it had an edge to it that could stop adults cold in their tracks. That was the first sentence I wrote of midwives, and I knew it was a midwife's daughter, and I was off and running. The disadvantage to first person is you're limited to the narrator's vocabulary. A benefit to first person is you can only share what that narrator can possibly know. Third person, which the Jackal's Mistress is, means I can be in any head I want. So, there are scenes in the Jackal's Mistress from 5 different characters' perspectives. I can write in the vernacular of the period without it seeming overwrought or like I'm working too hard. Great question. Thank you. Okay, last question. Yes.
Have you started working on your next novel?
And what's your name? Hi, Laura. Have I started working on my next novel? I have. It's done. You will see my next book in August of 2026 at Phoenix Books. It is called The Amateur. And The Amateur is set between 1978 and 1980. And it is about an 18-year-old woman, a world-class LPGA likely golfer, who one August day, before leaving for Yale, drives a golf ball through the practice net at the Tony Country Club where she plays, killing instantly a caddy, derailing her life. It is narrated by a 60-something female novelist known best for a book about a midwife on trial for manslaughter. I want to thank Garrett. First of all, you want to buy anything and everything he writes. You want to follow him on the socials. You want to read his Substack. I want to thank Ken Borey, who's in the house. Thank you, Ken, for all that you did. I saw somewhere my friend Brent Hallenbeck and Jennifer Carroll, 2 people in the house from my 25 years with the Burlington Free Press. Brent, thank you for keeping the lights on. I want to thank everyone at Phoenix Books. Bookstores are treasures, and I am a novelist because of bookstores and libraries. So Todd, Elena, everyone, Mike, everyone from Phoenix, I think I saw Drew, everyone from Phoenix who's in the house tonight, everyone who isn't here tonight, I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And most of all, I want to thank all of you. I see so many faces who I love from my past and present, and I am humbled and honored. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I bow before all of you. Thanks.